Every city has an ego meditating between the maintenance of its outward appearance and scratching the urges of its inner self. The Norwich with a church for every Sunday morning, and the Norwich with a pub for every night. This compromise is evident everywhere we walk in this concrete library, this city of stories of warring narratives and voices making themselves heard. There is an ongoing story, one not confined to a single space in this library, but as a competition for the physical space of the city itself. Street art and graffiti are terms used to differentiate between the outward self and the inner urges of the city. In Norwich City Council's own words, we understand the difference between street art, which is generally considered as an artistic and considered intervention, and graffiti, which is generally considered to have a negative impact. It's an interesting line to draw, as thick and scattered as that of spray paint itself. However, in the shared physical space of a city, street art and graffiti are not two isolated narratives working to their own ends, but rather two conflicting parts of the same narrative. Those who produce graffiti don't call themselves artists, but rather graffiti writers, and they are an important contribution to the narrative that shapes the ego of the city. We will examine Norwich's graffiti cityscape, analysing both what the Norwich City Council defines as street art and what it defines as graffiti, and zooming out to fully receive the wider tapestry of Norwich's narrative, with focus on how the city aims to both tame and release the inner urges working to seep through to the outward self. Sublimation is the diversion of a sexual or other biological impulse from its immediate goal to one of a more acceptable social, moral, or aesthetic nature or use. This is an underpass, a colourful diversion along Pottergate that takes you under Grapes Hill, and it's my walk home into the city centre. It's also one of Norwich's legal graffiti walls, a place where the council allows for graffiti writers to hone their skills, where the overexposure of the LED offers a helpful tool for painting as opposed to scattering the shadows graffiti writers often use for refuge to perform their work. In many ways, it is the city council's offer of a compromise to the street artists of Norwich. A method of sublimation whereby an act that the council has deemed illegal has been diverted to a more acceptable social, moral, or aesthetic nature or use. Essentially, the council has recontextualized graffiti as an illegal defacement of public city space into a considered intervention of the semi-hidden walkway beneath Pottergate. To the general public, the ego has created a productive outlet for the urge that is graffiti. However, what does graffiti become when recontextualized through this method of sublimation? Given the places graffiti is located, the overarching message, despite a particular content, is protester defines. So graffiti is saying one thing, we defy you, asserts gross and gross in their meaning of graffiti. Context defines graffiti. Though Gross Squared claims that location and context define graffiti, it could be argued that the works of art on the wall, no matter how defined in content, is a submission to public order and a stroking of the city's ego. Nevertheless, graffiti being a rapidly evolving art form, one should not underestimate the reflexivity of artists seeking to defy. Looking at the impact of such a space and the aesthetic quality of graffiti, it's clear in a glance that compared to much of the other graffiti hastily tagged with one eye over the shoulder, the technical artistry of the pieces in the underpass is allowed to bloom. The outlines are more complex, the colour schemes are intricate yet boldly applied, and a few of these are even given texture. For example, this piece is given the texture of a rock, with detailed cracks and parts of the words crumbling away. The use of shadows outlining the pieces, a rebelliously playful occupation, if not creation of space, reaching beyond the 2 square meters allotted by the city to paint on, as the depth provided by the shadows create the illusion of a third dimension. Not only are the spatial parameters of the underpass defined, the writer has created a space upon which the city cannot use and is solely dependent upon the existence of this graffiti to reject the social politics of ownership of both space and artistic form and style. Even the background is a lime pasture the city cannot access, an Eden man has cast God away from. Therefore, despite not appearing overtly defined in the content of the mural, the defiance of space recontextualizes the piece as far from shallow. It's currently raining and I wanted to go home by now, but the only thing keeping my head dry is the underpass. And I'm walking back and forth staring at the walls and I'm muttering to myself, how's it changed? How's it changed? You know, truth be told, the graffiti hasn't changed. As previously mentioned, the beauty of the designs flourishes in the underpass, but the underpass still contains more familiar-looking rough graffiti, toy and tags alike. I've been looking at the graffiti as if the underpass is meant to change my perspective on it. As if I'm meant to spit on the ground of sellouts and lay flowers in the grave of real graffiti. However, looking at the underpass from one end to the other, what's become abundantly clear is that it's not necessarily the graffiti that's been recontextualized, but rather the space upon which it exists by the street art. Another way graffiti writers define themselves is with the name urban interventionists. Pottergate Underpass is not the only wall where graffiti is allowed to exist. It is one of a series of urban interventions redefining who space belongs to in a city, as the politics of space are being rewritten on the walls for all to see. Where the council has made an attempt to repress this narrative, the voices of these writers still leak out. Oftentimes, those voices remain and become an accepted part of the city above the underpass. According to Kristen, the act of writing graffiti serves as a rite of passage into a resistance culture that represents a voice for marginalized or alienated groups in an effort to reclaim their physical environment through spray painting, and in the process that challenge the status quo. The graffiti in the underpass, therefore, are not symbols of defeat or submission, but murals of victory commemorating the growing acceptance of street art and the city's acknowledgement that the physical space of the city belongs to the artists and are proud to celebrate that heritage and assimilate them more publicly into the narrative of the city.